Imagine waking up in a paradise that is actually a prison. The air is thick with the scent of salt and eucalyptus, but beneath the beauty lies a terrifying reality. You aren't the explorer here. You're the game. On this isolated stretch of land, the laws of civilization have completely dissolved, replaced by a sport of blood. This is not a work of fiction or a horror movie trope. This is the dark, suppressed history of the Black War on the island of Tasmania. It was a time when the British Empire turned an entire landscape into a hunting ground. For the indigenous people, every rustle of a leaf meant a potential bullet from a hidden marksman. For decades, the narrative was scrubbed from history books, buried under the guise of settlement. But the truth is far more sinister. It was a systematic, organized hunt where human beings were tracked, cornered, and eliminated for sport and land. Today we go into the heart of the island where it was a truly terrible time to be human. Welcome to a journey into the darkest corners of the human psyche. We are exploring the events that turned a sun-drenched island into a literal killing field. How did a government-sanctioned line attempt to sweep an entire race off the map? Grab your gear and stay close. We are entering the territory of the hunters and the hunted. Before the blood began to flow, Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania, was a sprawling wilderness of unmatched beauty. Isolated from the world for over 10,000 years, the Palawa people lived in harmony with the rugged terrain. They knew every stream, every hidden cave, and every mountain peak. But their isolation would soon become their greatest vulnerability. In the early 1800s, the British arrived. They didn't see a culture or a community. They saw a blank canvas for a penal colony. They brought with them the outcasts of London, thieves, murderers, and the desperate. But they also brought a mindset of total dominion. The island was no longer a home. It was a resource to be harvested. At first, the encounters were small and cautious. But as the British expanded their sheep-grazing lands, the friction turned into fire. The settlers viewed the indigenous population as pests interfering with their profits. They didn't just want the land, they wanted the problem to disappear. This was the spark that ignited the longest-running conflict in Australian history. The authorities in London were far away, leaving the local governors to handle the native problem as they saw fit. What followed was a descent into lawlessness. Without a formal declaration of war, the settlers began to take matters into their own hands. They formed roving parties, armed to the teeth, ready to clear the vermin from the bush. The hunt didn't start with a bang, but with a whisper. It began with the Black Line, a plan so ambitious and so cruel it sounds like a myth. Imagine thousands of men forming a physical human chain across the entire island, moving forward in unison to drive the indigenous people into a corner. This was the ultimate hunt. In 1830, Governor George Arthur orchestrated the Black Line. He mobilized over 2,200 men, soldiers, free settlers, and even convicts promised their freedom. Their mission was simple: form a line 120 miles long and sweep the island. They were to capture or kill any indigenous person they encountered. It was the largest domestic military operation in colonial history. The logistics were a nightmare. The terrain was treacherous, filled with steep gullies and impenetrable forests. But the hunters were motivated by a dark purpose. They were supplied with tons of flour, meat, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. For many of the convicts, this wasn't just a military duty, it was a sanctioned chance to kill without consequence. The Palawa people were masters of camouflage. They watched from the shadows as this massive, clumsy machine moved through their backyard. They could have escaped, and many did, slipping through the gaps in the line under the cover of darkness. But the psychological impact was devastating. Their hunting grounds were being systematically invaded by an unstoppable force of iron and lead. The line lasted for weeks. It was an expensive, grueling failure in terms of actual captures, but it succeeded in one terrifying way. It sent a message. The British were no longer just living on the island, they were claiming it through total war. The era of the human hunt had officially shifted from opportunistic killings to state-sponsored extermination. The stories that emerged from this period are bone-chilling. There were reports of sporting parties where settlers would head into the bush on weekends specifically to track down indigenous families. These weren't soldiers. They were blacksmiths, farmers, and shopkeepers. To them, the locals were nothing more than black crows to be plucked from the trees. Some accounts describe indigenous people being driven to the edges of cliffs, forced to choose between a bullet or a leap into the churning abyss below. These were the moments where humanity was stripped away entirely. The island had become a giant trap, and every direction led to a different kind of death. The hunters were relentless. If you find these historical deep dives fascinating and want to ensure these stories aren't forgotten, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We explore the shadows of history every week. Now, let's get back to the darkest chapter of the Tasmanian hunt, the Black War's final solution. But do not think the Palawa went quietly. They fought back with a brilliance that terrified the colonizers. They used guerrilla tactics long before the term was popularized. They would vanish into the scrub, only to reappear behind the hunting parties. They used the very land that was being stolen from them as a weapon of war. The settlers lived in a state of constant paranoia. Every night they barricaded their doors, listening for the sound of feet on the floorboards. The hunted had become the haunters. The indigenous warriors focused on the isolated outposts, the shepherds who strayed too far, and the hunters who thought they were safe in their numbers. It was a war of nerves. The British were frustrated. Their advanced weaponry was useless in the dense, tangled, horizontal scrub of the Tasmanian interior. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, in a land they didn't understand. This frustration led to an escalation of brutality. If they couldn't catch the warriors, they would target the most vulnerable members of the tribes. This is where the history becomes truly stomach-churning. The hunts weren't just for land, they became for science. Indigenous remains were highly sought after by European museums. This created a secondary market for the hunters. Killing a human being wasn't just a way to clear the land. It became a way to make a quick profit from specimens. As the conflict dragged on, the British changed their strategy. They realized they couldn't kill everyone through hunting alone. They turned to the conciliator, George Augustus Robinson. His mission was to find the remaining survivors and convince them to leave their ancestral lands for their own protection. It was a relocation that felt like a funeral procession. Robinson traveled thousands of miles across the rugged terrain. He promised the survivors safety, food, and a return to their lands once the troubles had passed. Many, broken by years of being hunted like animals, saw no other choice. They surrendered their spears and walked out of the forests they had called home for millennia. The survivors were taken to Waibelena on Flinders Island. It was advertised as a sanctuary, but it was a graveyard. Stripped of their culture, forced to wear European clothes, and forbidden from practicing their traditions, the survivors began to die of heartbreak and disease. The hunt had ended, but the slow extinction had just begun. At Waibelena, the Palawa were subjected to a different kind of hunting, the hunting of their souls. They were told their God was wrong, their language was savage, and their very existence was a mistake of nature. The psychological toll was so great that many simply stopped eating. They sat on the shore, looking toward the mainland they would never see again. Back on the main island, the settlers were celebrating. They had won. The land was theirs. Sheep now grazed where the Palawa had once hunted kangaroo. The Black War was over, and the victors began the process of erasing the losers from the narrative. They called it a peaceful settlement, a lie that would persist for over a century. But the land remembers. To this day, hikers in the Tasmanian wilderness stumble upon killing fields, areas where the soil seems unnaturally dark, or where stone tools are found scattered near old colonial ruins. The island is beautiful, yes, but it is a beauty built on a foundation of bone. The ghosts of the hunted still linger. Against all odds, the Palawa people did not disappear. Despite the scientific claims that the last full-blooded Tasmanian indigenous person died in 1026, the community survived. They are still here today, fighting for recognition and the return of their ancestral remains. The story of the Tasmanian human hunt is a mirror held up to humanity. It shows us what happens when we view the other as less than ourselves. When land and profit are placed above the sanctity of life, the hunter loses their humanity just as surely as the hunted loses their life. The line failed to catch the Palawa, but it succeeded in catching the darkness within the colonial heart. It stands as a warning. The transition from neighbor to predator is shorter than we like to admit. History isn't just a series of dates, it's a series of choices. As we look back at the island where humans were hunted, we have to ask ourselves, has the world truly changed, or have the hunting grounds simply moved into the digital age, into the shadows of our modern conflicts? Tasmania was not an isolated incident. Throughout history, isolated territories have often become laboratories for cruelty. The concept of the human hunt has appeared time and again. It is a recurring nightmare in the human story. The sport of hunting humans was fueled by a toxic cocktail of social Darwinism and colonial greed. By labeling their fellow humans as game, they turned murder into a chore, or worse, a pastime. If you were on that island in 1830, your survival depended on your ability to disappear. You had to become part of the land itself. It was a life lived in a state of constant fear, where the smallest sound could mean death. The frustration of the hunters is recorded in their own words. They couldn't understand how a people they considered primitive could outsmart them. They didn't realize they were fighting people defending their home. Today, the island stands as both a place of mourning and resilience. The hunted have reclaimed their voice. They are telling their own stories now. The human hunt is a stain on our history that can never be erased. But by acknowledging it, we ensure that the victims are remembered not as game, but as ancestors. As we close this chapter on the island of the hunted, remember that history is not just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark.